In the early months of 1941, a relatively unknown German general arrived in North Africa and began rewriting the rules of desert warfare. His name was Erwin Rommel. Within a year, British soldiers would speak of him with a mixture of fear and respect, and American generals thousands of miles away in Washington would quietly question whether the British Empire could hold the line at all. North Africa was never meant to be Germany's main battlefield. Adolf Hitler's focus was Europe and the looming invasion of the Soviet Union. But when Italy's forces faltered against the British in Libya, Berlin intervened. In February 1941, Rommel arrived to command what would soon be known as the Afrika Korps. His orders were defensive: stabilize the front and prevent total Italian collapse. Rommel had other ideas. Instead of digging in, he attacked. Using speed, deception, and aggressive maneuver warfare, he struck British positions before they could fully reorganize. The vast, open desert became his battlefield laboratory. Tanks moved like naval fleets across a sea of sand. Supply lines stretched thin for both sides, but Rommel gambled that boldness would compensate for shortages. It often did. In March and April of 1941, Axis forces pushed the British back hundreds of miles across Cyrenaica. Town after town fell in rapid succession. British commanders, caught off guard by the ferocity and tempo of the German counteroffensive, struggled to establish a stable defensive line. Rommel ignored traditional caution. He advanced beyond secure supply coverage, trusting speed and surprise to keep the British off balance. One port city stood as a stubborn exception: Tobruk. Australian and British troops fortified its defenses and held out under siege for months. Yet even with Tobruk resisting, the broader strategic picture favored Rommel. His name began appearing in British newspapers with alarming frequency. The Desert Fox, journalists called him, a commander who seemed to outthink and outmaneuver his opponents at every turn. By early 1942, the war in North Africa had settled into a brutal rhythm of attack and counterattack. Sandstorms blinded entire formations. Engines clogged with grit. Water was rationed by the cup. But logistics would prove as decisive as courage. Fuel, ammunition, spare parts, these were the true currencies of desert war. In March 1942, Rommel launched a major offensive near Gazala. Again, he employed deception, swinging armored divisions in a wide flanking movement that stunned British planners. Axis forces broke through minefields and defensive boxes, encircling Allied units. Within weeks, the British line collapsed. Then came Tobruk. On June 21, 1942, after a concentrated assault, Tobruk fell to Axis forces. Around 33,000 Allied troops were captured. It was one of the most significant British defeats of the war. The shockwaves traveled far beyond the desert. In London, Prime Minister Churchill called it a heavy and grievous loss. In Berlin, the victory elevated Rommel to field marshal. But perhaps the most revealing reactions occurred in Washington. The United States had entered the war only months earlier, after Pearl Harbor. American forces were mobilizing at unprecedented speed, but they were still largely untested against German ground troops. U.S. military planners studied events in North Africa closely. If the British, veterans of nearly 3 years of war against Germany, could not stop Rommel, what did that imply about the Wehrmacht's strength? Reports circulated within the U.S. War Department assessing the possibility of total British collapse in Egypt. The fall of Cairo would open the road to the Suez Canal, a lifeline of the British Empire. Control of Suez would threaten Middle Eastern oil supplies and potentially link German forces with Axis positions in the Caucasus. The geopolitical consequences would be immense. American strategists quietly drafted contingency plans. Some discussions considered the need for direct U.S. intervention in North Africa sooner than anticipated.
Others examined worst-case scenarios, evacuation routes, defensive perimeters, and the potential need to prioritize other theaters if Egypt fell. By July 1942, Rommel's forces had pushed deep into Egypt. The British Eighth Army retreated again, this time halting near a small railway stop called El Alamein. The geography there offered a rare advantage. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south stretched the impassable Qattara Depression. Unlike previous positions in the open desert, this line could not be easily outflanked. For the first time in months, the British had a defensible choke point. Yet confidence remained fragile. Rommel, though strained by supply shortages and extended lines of communication, still possessed seasoned armored divisions and a reputation for audacity. British morale had suffered repeated blows, equipment losses were heavy, leadership changes reflected desperation as much as strategy. Across the Atlantic, American observers remained skeptical. Intelligence summaries described Rommel as adaptable, relentless, and operationally brilliant. Some U.S. officers privately questioned whether British command structures were too rigid to counter such an opponent. The idea that Egypt might fall no longer seemed alarmistic. It was a scenario to be planned for. But war is never static. Rommel's advance had come at a cost. Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean faced increasing attacks from British and air forces. Fuel shortages began limiting operational mobility. Tanks that could not move were little more than steel bunkers in the sand. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Reinforcements were slower to arrive. Still, perception mattered, and in mid-1942, the perception was clear. The Axis held the initiative. The Desert Fox had driven the British from Libya to the gates of Egypt. The aura of invincibility clung to his name. In London, political pressure mounted. In Washington, contingency papers multiplied. In Cairo, soldiers dug trenches under a merciless sun, knowing that retreat was no longer an option. The stage was set. Rommel believed one more decisive blow could shatter British resistance completely. Many American generals feared he might be right. What none of them yet understood was that the desert, which had rewarded speed and daring, was about to test endurance, logistics, and leadership in ways that would redefine the campaign. At El Alamein, the long retreat would finally stop.
In the spring of 1941, when the war in Europe was already raging across continents, few in Washington paid close attention to the deserts of North Africa. To many American observers, Libya and Egypt seemed distant, secondary theaters in a global conflict dominated by headlines from London and Moscow. That perception would not last long. In February 1941, a bold and unconventional German commander arrived in Tripoli to rescue a failing Axis campaign. His name was Erwin Rommel. Officially, he had been sent to stabilize the front after Italy's humiliating defeats at the hands of British Commonwealth forces. Unofficially, he intended to seize the initiative. Rommel wasted no time. Rather than consolidating defensive positions as instructed, he launched immediate counterattacks. Leading the newly formed Afrika Korps, he exploited surprise and speed. British commanders, believing German forces were still organizing, were caught off guard by the sudden ferocity of the assault. Within weeks, Axis units drove the British back across Cyrenaica, retaking territory that had been lost only months earlier. The desert transformed into a battlefield unlike any other. There were no forests to hide in, no mountains for cover, only vast open expanses of sand and rock. Maneuver was everything. Tanks clashed in sweeping arcs across the horizon, kicking up dust clouds visible for miles. Supply trucks became as critical as armored divisions. Fuel and water determined how far an army could advance and whether it could survive. Rommel understood this environment instinctively. He moved fast,
often faster than his own logistics officers preferred. He gambled that constant pressure would prevent the British from reorganizing. Time and again, the gamble paid off. Yet one stronghold resisted: Tobruk. The port city, defended largely by Australian troops, refused to fall despite repeated assaults. Its stubborn defense disrupted Rommel's supply lines and forced a prolonged siege. Still, even with Tobruk holding out, the broader momentum favored the Axis. British forces were repeatedly forced into retreat, and Rommel's reputation grew with each success. By early 1942, the campaign had become a brutal contest of endurance. Sandstorms disabled engines, temperatures soared above 40 degrees Celsius, weapons malfunctioned under layers of fine desert dust. But beyond the physical hardships lay a deeper struggle: command and confidence. In May 1942, Rommel launched what became known as the Battle of Gazala. Using a daring flanking maneuver, he swept around the British defensive line in a wide arc through the desert. The move caught Allied commanders off balance. Axis armor penetrated minefields and defensive positions, encircling key units. The British line collapsed with alarming speed. Then came the fall of Tobruk. On June 21, 1942, after a concentrated assault, the port finally surrendered. Approximately 33,000 Allied troops were captured. The loss sent shockwaves through London. Prime Minister Winston Churchill later described it as one of the heaviest blows of the war. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler promoted Rommel to Field Marshal, the youngest in the German army at that time. Across the Atlantic, American military planners studied these events with growing concern. The United States had formally entered the war only months earlier, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Its armed forces were expanding rapidly, but they lacked extensive combat experience against German ground forces. For American generals, the performance of Britain's army in North Africa served as a critical test case. If seasoned British troops could not stop Rommel, what would happen when American forces faced the Wehrmacht directly? Intelligence assessments painted a troubling picture. Rommel appeared adaptable, bold, and operationally brilliant. His forces, though numerically limited, consistently achieved local superiority through maneuver and surprise. Reports suggested that British command structures were struggling to respond effectively to his rapid tactics. By July 1942, Axis forces had advanced into Egypt itself. British units retreated eastward, halting near a small railway station called Alamein. The location was strategically vital. To the north lay the Mediterranean Sea. To the south, the vast Qattara Depression, terrain so harsh it was impassable for large forces. Unlike previous defensive lines, this one could not be easily outflanked. For the British Eighth Army, this was the final stand before Alexandria and Cairo. In Washington, contingency discussions quietly intensified. The potential fall of Egypt threatened the Suez Canal, a lifeline of imperial communication and supply. If the canal were lost, Axis forces could disrupt routes to India and the Middle East, potentially gaining access to vital oil resources. The geopolitical implications were immense. Some American planners even considered worst-case scenarios: the possibility of a British collapse in the region and the need for accelerated U.S. intervention. Though official statements remained confident, private doubts were real. But beneath Rommel's dramatic advance lay hidden vulnerabilities. His supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of desert and across the Mediterranean Sea, where British naval and air forces increasingly targeted Axis convoys. Fuel shortages became chronic. Replacement tanks and spare parts arrived slowly. Every mile forward made supply more difficult. Rommel's army, for all its tactical brilliance, was operating at the end of a fragile logistical chain. Still, in the summer of 1942, perception outweighed those weaknesses. The Desert Fox seemed unstoppable. His name commanded respect, even admiration among his enemies. British morale had suffered repeated shocks. American observers questioned whether the tide could be reversed at all. But at Alamein, the geography of the desert imposed limits. There would be no wide flanking sweep this time, no easy bypass. The narrow corridor between sea and depression forced a confrontation head-on. As soldiers dug defensive positions into the hardened sand, the stakes became unmistakable. For Britain, defeat meant the possible loss of Egypt and perhaps the collapse of its position in the Middle East. For the United States, it was a moment of sober calculation, an early test of whether the Axis war machine was truly invincible. Rommel prepared for one final push eastward. Many American generals feared he might succeed. What none of them yet understood was that the momentum of war was about to shift, not through daring maneuver alone, but through preparation, industrial strength, and a refusal to retreat any further. The long advance across the desert had brought the Afrika Korps to the edge of its reach. At Alamein, the retreating line would finally hold.
By August 1942, the British position in North Africa stood on a knife's edge. Months of retreat had drained morale, exhausted formations, and shaken confidence from Cairo to London. The Eighth Army had fallen back hundreds of miles, and though the line at El Alamein offered a rare geographic advantage, geography alone would not win the coming battle. What the British needed was not merely a defensive position. They needed belief. That belief arrived in the form of a new commander, Bernard Montgomery. Montgomery took command of the Eighth Army in August 1942. Unlike some of his predecessors, he was methodical, deliberate, and uncompromising. Where others had spoken cautiously of flexibility and maneuver, Montgomery spoke of certainty. There would be no further retreat. The line at El Alamein would be held, and from it, an offensive would eventually be launched. He understood that before tanks moved, morale had to be rebuilt. Montgomery toured units personally, addressing soldiers face to face. He simplified command structures, removed officers he considered ineffective, and demanded clarity in planning. His message was consistent. Rommel could be beaten. The myth of invincibility surrounding the Desert Fox was just that, a myth. But confidence alone would not defeat the Afrika Korps. Montgomery insisted on preparation at a scale the Desert Campaign had not yet seen. Throughout late summer and early autumn of 1942, Allied supply lines surged with activity. Fresh Sherman tanks arrived from the United States. Artillery pieces were stockpiled in unprecedented numbers. Ammunition depots grew behind the lines. The Royal Air Force intensified attacks on Axis supply convoys crossing the Mediterranean, further straining Rommel's already fragile logistics. Montgomery refused to rush. He believed in overwhelming force applied at the decisive point. Every detail was studied: minefield layouts, artillery coordination, infantry-tank cooperation. Engineers rehearsed clearing lanes through dense belts of German and Italian mines. Units practiced night advances to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The contrast with earlier British operations was striking. Where previous offensives had sometimes been hurried or reactive, this one would be deliberate and meticulously prepared. Meanwhile, Rommel faced mounting difficulties. Fuel shortages limited his operational flexibility. Replacement equipment arrived slowly. Many of his units were under strength after months of continuous combat. Though still respected and feared, his army no longer enjoyed the freedom of movement that had defined its earlier victories. Montgomery understood this shift. He recognized that time now favored the Allies. He also implemented deception measures designed to confuse Axis intelligence. Dummy tanks and artillery were constructed in the southern sector of the line, suggesting that the main attack would occur there.
Meanwhile, the true concentration of forces gathered quietly in the north. Supply dumps were camouflaged. Radio traffic was manipulated to reinforce the illusion. The goal was simple. When the blow came, it would land where Rommel least expected it. Yet within the Eighth Army, memories of defeat lingered. Soldiers remembered the fall of Tobruk. They remembered long retreats across burning desert under constant pressure. Montgomery addressed this directly. He prohibited talk of withdrawal. Plans for retreat were not merely discouraged, they were removed. Symbolically and practically, this would be a battle fought forward. Across the Atlantic, American observers noted the change in tone. Reports from Cairo suggested a new determination within British command. U.S. military planners, who had once drafted contingency scenarios for a British collapse, now watched closely to see whether this newly rebuilt Eighth Army could truly stand and fight. By October 1942, the buildup was complete. The Eighth Army possessed significant numerical superiority in tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Perhaps more importantly, it possessed unity of command and a clear operational objective. Montgomery's plan called for a massive artillery barrage to open the battle, one of the largest seen in the Desert War. Infantry would advance under cover of darkness, clearing paths through minefields in a carefully coordinated assault known as Operation Lightfoot. Armored divisions would then exploit the breaches, engaging and wearing down Axis forces in a battle of attrition. This was not Rommel's style of rapid, sweeping maneuver. It was a grinding, methodical approach designed to leverage Allied material advantage. On the eve of battle, Montgomery issued a final message to his troops. He told them that this would be the turning point. He told them that the enemy must be destroyed in North Africa, and he told them that there would be no more retreats. For the soldiers waiting in their trenches, the desert night felt tense and electric. Engines were checked in whispers. Artillery crews stood ready. The horizon remained quiet, but everyone understood that within hours it would erupt into fire. Rommel himself was not present at the immediate start of the offensive, having temporarily returned to Europe due to illness. Command initially fell to his subordinates, but whether present or not, his army would soon face the most concentrated Allied assault of the campaign. Months earlier, American generals had questioned whether Britain could stop the German advance. Now the question was different. Could this newly rebuilt Eighth Army do more than hold? Could it strike back decisively? At Alamein, preparation met opportunity. The long retreat had ended. The rebuilding was complete. The next move would decide whether the legend of the Desert Fox would endure or begin to unravel in the sands of Egypt.
On the night of October 23, 1942, the desert exploded into light. At precisely 9:40 p.m., more than 800 British guns opened fire along the line at El Alamein. The barrage shattered the silence of the Egyptian night with a thunder that could be heard for miles. For soldiers on both sides, it was immediately clear this was not another probing attack. This was the beginning of something far larger. The offensive, planned by Bernard Montgomery, was called Operation Lightfoot. The name reflected the first phase of the assault. Infantry would advance across dense minefields under cover of darkness. Because soldiers were lighter than tanks, they could pass over some mines without triggering them, at least in theory. Behind them, engineers would clear narrow corridors through the mine belts, allowing armored divisions to push forward at dawn. Facing them was the formidable Afrika Korps, along with Italian divisions entrenched behind extensive defensive works. The minefields, known grimly as the Devil's Gardens, stretched for miles. Barbed wire, anti-tank guns, and artillery positions were carefully layered to blunt any frontal assault. But this time, the British were prepared. The opening bombardment was relentless.
Shell after shell crashed into Axis positions, targeting known artillery batteries and defensive strongpoints. The sky flickered with muzzle flashes. Shock waves rippled through the sand. Axis soldiers huddled in dugouts as the earth above them shook. Shortly after the barrage began to lift, British infantry moved forward into the darkness. Progress was slow and costly. Minefields proved denser than expected. Engineers worked under fire, probing for explosives with bayonets and clearing lanes by hand. In some sectors, armored units became bottlenecked, forced to wait as narrow corridors were painstakingly carved through the sand. Confusion spread as units struggled to maintain alignment in the dark. Rommel, having returned to North Africa upon learning of the attack, quickly grasped the scale of the threat. Though his forces were strained by supply shortages, especially fuel, he moved reserves to critical sectors. German anti-tank guns, particularly the feared 88mm, inflicted heavy losses on advancing British armor. For days, the battle seesawed. The British had achieved penetration, but not a decisive breakthrough. Casualties mounted on both sides. Tanks burned in the desert sun. Infantry fought for isolated ridges and defensive strongpoints. The fighting was brutal, often at close range. Yet this was precisely the kind of battle Montgomery had intended. Unlike previous engagements defined by sweeping maneuvers, this confrontation was a grinding contest of attrition. The British could replace tanks and ammunition more easily than the Axis could. Allied control of the Mediterranean sea lanes, combined with air superiority, meant Rommel's supply situation grew worse with each passing day. Fuel was the critical weakness. German armored units, even when tactically successful, could not maneuver freely. Counterattacks were constrained by dwindling reserves. Every destroyed tank was harder to replace. Every artillery shell fired was one less in limited stockpiles. By early November, the balance began to tip unmistakably. On November 2nd, Montgomery launched a renewed assault known as Operation Supercharge. Concentrated attacks targeted a weakened sector of the Axis line. British and Commonwealth forces pressed forward with overwhelming artillery and air support. The pressure became relentless. Rommel reported to Berlin that his army could no longer hold without immediate reinforcements and fuel. But reinforcements were not forthcoming in sufficient strength. Supplies crossing the Mediterranean faced constant attack. The logistical chain that had supported the dramatic advances of 1941 and early 1942 was now faltering. Adolf Hitler ordered Rommel to stand fast, no retreat. But battlefield reality left little room for rigid directives. Axis lines were buckling. Italian divisions, particularly exposed, began to collapse under sustained assault. Gaps widened. British armor pushed deeper, threatening encirclement. Rommel faced a decision that would define the campaign. On November 4th, recognizing that continued resistance risked total destruction of his forces, he ordered a withdrawal westward. It was a bitter moment. The army that had once advanced triumphantly across Libya was now retreating under constant pressure. The myth of invincibility had been broken. British forces pursued, though cautiously. Montgomery refused to overextend recklessly into the desert, mindful of earlier reversals. Still, the scale of the victory was undeniable. Thousands of Axis prisoners were captured. Vast quantities of equipment were abandoned in the retreat. For the first time in the North African campaign, the strategic initiative had decisively shifted. Across the Allied world, the impact was immediate. In London, news of the breakthrough sparked celebrations. Prime Minister Churchill famously declared that this was not the end, nor even the beginning of the end, but perhaps the end of the beginning. In Washington, American military leaders took careful note. Months earlier, some had privately doubted whether Britain could halt Rommel's advance. Now, the British Eighth Army had not only held the line, It had forced the Axis Corps into retreat. The Second Battle of El Alamein was more than a tactical victory. It marked the first clear, large-scale land defeat of German forces in the war's Western theater. It demonstrated that with preparation, coordination, and material superiority, the Wehrmacht could be beaten in open battle. For Rommel, it was the beginning of a long withdrawal across North Africa. For the Allies, it was proof that the tide of war could turn, even in the harshest desert on Earth. And for the soldiers who had endured the thunder of artillery and the terror of minefields, it was the moment when fear gave way to belief.
When the guns fell silent at El Alamein in early November 1942, the desert did not simply mark the end of a battle. It marked the beginning of a strategic transformation. For months, the name Erwin Rommel had symbolized German momentum. His rapid advances across Libya and into Egypt had forced Allied retreats and triggered private doubts within American command circles. Some U.S. generals had quietly prepared for the possibility that Britain might lose North Africa entirely. Now, those assumptions had been overturned. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success. It was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. El Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success. It was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. El Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success. It was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate.
Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. El Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success, it was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. El Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success, it was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. El Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success, it was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain and the Commonwealth. Soldiers who had endured long retreats now felt vindicated. The desert, once associated with defeat, had become the site of redemption. In Washington, the reaction was more analytical, but no less significant. American military planners had studied every phase of the North African campaign. Earlier in 1942, intelligence reports had questioned whether British command could effectively counter German operational flexibility. The fall of Tobruk had intensified those doubts. Some American officers had even explored contingency planning for a British collapse in Egypt. Alamein changed that calculus. The victory achieved by Bernard Montgomery and the Eighth Army was not a minor defensive success. It was decisive. The once feared Afrika Korps was in full retreat, abandoning equipment and prisoners as it fell back toward Libya. In London, the psychological impact was immediate. Prime Minister Winston Churchill addressed the nation with cautious triumph. For a country that had endured years of bombing, setbacks, and uncertainty, El Alamein offered something rare: clear, unambiguous good news. Churchill famously framed the moment as a turning point, not the end of the war, but a shift in its direction. Morale surged across Britain